Venezuela had the largest proven oil reserves in the world. More oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq, more than all of North America combined. This wealth should have made Venezuela the richest nation in Latin America. Instead, Venezuela became the poorest. The country's GDP collapsed by 75%. Inflation reached 1 million% annually. 7 million people, over 20% of the population, fled the country. Children starved in a nation sitting on an ocean of oil. This is the story of how socialist policies, corruption, and economic mismanagement destroyed the richest country in South America in less than 2 decades. The numbers tell the story. In 1950, Venezuela had the 4th highest GDP per capita in the world, higher than West Germany, France, or Japan. Venezuelan currency, the Bolivar, was one of the most stable in the world. By 2019, Venezuela's GDP per capita had fallen below Haiti's. The Bolivar became worthless, literally. People burned cash for warmth because it was cheaper than buying firewood. A cup of coffee cost 1 million bolivars. A year later, it cost 2.5 million. The next year, the government gave up and removed 6 zeros from the currency. It didn't matter. Inflation continued destroying whatever remained. This collapse didn't happen overnight. It was deliberate. Policies implemented over 20 years systematically destroyed every mechanism that creates wealth. Price controls eliminated profit incentives. Nationalizations destroyed industries. Currency controls strangled trade. Printing money to cover deficits hyperinflated the currency. Each policy made logical sense to populist politicians. Each policy destroyed the economy. Venezuela went from being the richest country in South America to having citizens eating from garbage cans in 1 generation. Understanding Venezuela matters because the same policies keep getting proposed elsewhere. Universal basic income, massive deficit spending, price controls on essentials, nationalization of industries, wealth redistribution. These sound compassionate. Venezuela tried all of them. The result was economic apocalypse. The lessons are clear, but they're ignored because the political incentives to promise free things are stronger than the economic reality that someone has to pay for them. Venezuela's oil wealth created the conditions for collapse. When Hugo Chávez took power in 1999, oil prices were $16 per barrel. By 2008, they reached $140. This massive revenue influx let Chavez spend without apparent consequences. He nationalized industries, created social programs, distributed oil profits directly to citizens. As long as oil stayed expensive, the system functioned, but it was built on sand. The economy depended entirely on oil revenue. When prices collapsed in 2014, the entire structure fell apart. There was no economic diversification, no productive capacity outside oil, no way to generate wealth when the oil money stopped flowing. The nationalization campaign destroyed Venezuela's productive capacity. Chavez nationalized over 1,000 companies between 1999 and his death in 2013. Oil, electricity, telecommunications, banking, steel, cement, food production, entire industries were seized and placed under government control. The rationale was that profits should belong to the people rather than private owners. The reality was that government-run companies became inefficient, corrupt, and ultimately collapsed. PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, demonstrates the pattern. Before Chavez, PDVSA was one of the world's most competent national oil companies. It produced 3.5 million barrels per day and generated enormous profits. Chavez fired 18,000 experienced workers in 2002 to 2003 after they struck against his policies. He replaced technical experts with political loyalists. Production expertise was lost, maintenance was deferred, investment disappeared. By 2020, production had fallen to 300,000 barrels per day, a 91% collapse. The company with the world's largest oil reserves couldn't produce oil. The agricultural sector followed the same trajectory. Venezuela was self-sufficient in food production in the 1980s. The country produced coffee, sugar, corn, rice, meat, and dairy domestically. Grocery stores offered variety and abundance. Chavez nationalized farms and food processing companies, seizing over 5 million hectares of agricultural land. He implemented land reform, taking productive farms from experienced owners and redistributing land to supporters who lacked farming expertise or equipment. The results were immediate and devastating. Production collapsed across all major crops. Coffee production, once a major export, fell 70%. Corn production dropped 65%. Rice production declined 80%. Cattle herds were slaughtered as ranchers faced expropriation. Meat production fell from 500,000 tons annually to 150,000 tons. The new landowners lacked knowledge, equipment, and access to inputs like fertilizer and seeds. Many parcels sat idle or were used for subsistence farming rather than commercial production. Venezuela went from feeding itself to importing 70% of food. When the government ran out of dollars to pay for imports after oil prices collapsed, food became scarce. Supermarkets emptied. People waited in lines for 6, 8, 10 hours to buy limited quantities of price-controlled goods. The government implemented a fingerprint system to prevent people from buying more than their allotted share. Black markets flourished, selling food at 10 to 20 times official prices. Malnutrition became widespread. The average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds in 2017 alone, not by choice, but from hunger. Price controls destroyed what nationalization didn't. Chavez and his successor Nicolás Maduro implemented price controls on food, medicine, and consumer goods. The goal was making essentials affordable for the poor. The effect was eliminating supply. When the government sets a price below production cost, businesses stop producing. Farmers stopped growing crops they couldn't sell profitably. Manufacturers stopped making goods that generated losses. Smugglers bought price-controlled goods in Venezuela and sold them in Colombia at market prices. The country bled resources across borders while its own citizens faced shortages. The electricity sector illustrates the cascading failures. Venezuela nationalized electricity in 2007. The government-run company failed to maintain infrastructure or invest in new capacity. Blackouts became routine. In March 2019, a massive blackout left the entire country without power for a week. Hospitals lost refrigeration for medicines, water pumps stopped working, food spoiled. The blackout killed an estimated 80 people and cost the economy over $400 million. Venezuela sits on massive hydroelectric resources and oil to generate power. Yet its citizens lived in darkness because government mismanagement destroyed the electrical grid. Currency controls strangled international trade. In 2003, Chavez implemented currency controls to prevent capital flight. Citizens couldn't freely exchange bolivars for dollars. The government set an official exchange rate far below the market rate and controlled who could access dollars. This created a parallel black market where the bolivar traded at much weaker rates. Businesses that needed to import goods couldn't get dollars at official rates. They either stopped importing or used the black market, where dollars cost 5 to 10 times more. This increased costs, reduced supply, and fed inflation. The multiple exchange rates created massive corruption opportunities. If you had political connections and could get dollars at the official rate, say 10 bolivars per dollar, you could immediately sell those dollars on the black market for 100 bolivars per dollar. This arbitrage generated instant 1,000% profits. Billions of dollars were stolen this way. Government officials and connected businessmen made fortunes. The treasury was looted. The exchange rate system designed to control capital flight became the primary mechanism for stealing public wealth. Money printing accelerated as oil revenue declined. When oil was $100 per barrel, Venezuela's government spent money freely on social programs and subsidies. When oil collapsed to $30 in 2014 to 2016, revenue disappeared, but spending didn't. The government couldn't cut programs politically, so it borrowed. When borrowing became impossible, it printed money. The central bank monetized deficits by creating bolivars from nothing. More bolivars chasing fewer goods means prices rise. Inflation accelerated from 60% in 2014 to 1,000,000% by 2018. Hyperinflation destroyed savings and prevented economic planning. When prices double every few weeks, money becomes useless as a store of value. People spent money immediately upon receiving it because it would be worth less tomorrow. Workers demanded daily wage payments instead of monthly salaries. Employers paid workers at lunchtime so they could buy food before afternoon price increases. ATM withdrawal limits became meaningless. The maximum withdrawal couldn't buy a cup of coffee. The specific inflation numbers reveal the acceleration. In 2012, inflation was 21% annually, high but manageable. In 2013, it reached 41%. In 2014, 62%. In 2015, 121%. In 2016, 254%. In 2017, 863%. Then it exploded. In 2018, the IMF estimated inflation hit 1 million%, making Venezuela's inflation higher than 1920s Germany. In 2019, inflation reached an estimated 10 million% before the government stopped publishing data. Real-world price examples show the insanity. In 2016, a dozen eggs cost 200 bolivars. In 2017, 15,000 bolivars. In 2018, 7 million bolivars. A cup of coffee that cost 450 bolivars in 2016 cost 1 million in 2018 and 2.5 million in 2019. Toilet paper became more valuable than cash. People used Bolivar notes as napkins because buying napkins cost more than using money as napkins. Street vendors weighed cash instead of counting it because counting millions of near-worthless bills was impractical. The government's response was denial followed by currency manipulation. In 2008, Chavez removed 3 zeros from the Bolivar, creating the Bolivar Fuerte, strong Bolivar. In 2018, Maduro removed 5 more zeros, creating the Bolivar Soberano, sovereign Bolivar. In 2021, 6 more zeros were removed, 14 zeros total eliminated from the currency in 13 years. Each redenomination was presented as solving inflation. Each time, inflation continued because the underlying cause, printing money to cover deficits, never stopped. The humanitarian consequences were catastrophic. Malnutrition became widespread as food disappeared. The average Venezuelan lost 24 pounds in 2017 alone, not by choice, but from lack of food. Children suffered most severely. Child malnutrition rates reached 30%. Babies were born underweight. Growth stunting affected hundreds of thousands of children. The damage to physical and cognitive development from childhood malnutrition is permanent. Medicine became unavailable. Pharmacies ran out of basics, antibiotics, pain relievers, insulin, cancer drugs. Hospitals lacked supplies for surgeries. Operating rooms had no anesthesia, no surgical gloves, no sterilization equipment. Doctors performed surgeries with patients awake, screaming in pain. Cancer patients died because chemotherapy drugs didn't exist. Diabetics died because insulin wasn't available. HIV patients died because antiretroviral drugs ran out. Diseases that had been eradicated returned. Malaria cases increased 1,000%. Tuberculosis surged. Diphtheria, eliminated in Venezuela for 25 years, came back, killing children. Maternal mortality increased 65% as hospitals lacked equipment for safe deliveries and emergency cesarean sections. Infant mortality rose 30% as newborns died from preventable complications. Life expectancy fell from 74 years in 2013 to 72 years in 2018, reversing decades of health improvements. Medical professionals fled the country. Over 30,000 doctors, half of Venezuela's medical workforce, emigrated by 2019. They left because hospitals couldn't function, because their salaries were worthless due to inflation, because they couldn't afford to feed their own families on doctor wages. Those who remained often worked for free or accepted payment in food. The healthcare system that had once been a model for Latin America became a death trap. The refugee crisis rivaled Syria's. 7 million Venezuelans fled the country, over 20% of the population. Colombia absorbed 2.5 million. Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and Argentina took millions more. This exodus drained Venezuela of its educated and skilled workers. Doctors, engineers, teachers left for countries where their work had value. The brain drain ensured Venezuela couldn't recover even if policies changed because the human capital needed to rebuild had emigrated. Crime exploded as the economy collapsed. Venezuela became one of the most dangerous countries on earth. Caracas had a murder rate of 120 per 100,000, making it the world's most dangerous city. Kidnapping became a major industry. Armed gangs controlled entire neighborhoods. Police were understaffed, underpaid, and often corrupt. The state lost its monopoly on violence. Citizens lived in fear, businesses were extorted, the social fabric disintegrated. Oil dependency made Venezuela uniquely vulnerable. Roughly 95% of export earnings came from oil. When oil prices collapsed, the country had no other source of foreign currency. Unlike diversified economies that can shift resources when one sector struggles, Venezuela had put all its wealth into oil and let other industries decay. Manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, sectors that could have provided alternative income, had been destroyed by nationalization, price controls, and currency mismanagement. Corruption accelerated the collapse. Transparency International consistently ranked Venezuela among the world's most corrupt countries. Government officials stole billions through currency arbitrage, fake import contracts, and embezzlement. Maduro's government reportedly shipped 73 tons of gold, worth $2 billion, to Turkey and Dubai between 2018 to 2020 to generate cash for elites while citizens starved. The kleptocracy enriched itself while the nation collapsed. International sanctions worsened the crisis but weren't its cause. The U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuelan officials in 2015 and oil sector sanctions in 2019. These limited Venezuela's ability to sell oil and access international finance. But Venezuela's economic collapse began in 2014, before major sanctions. The fundamental causes were domestic policies, nationalization, price controls, currency controls, deficit spending, and money printing. Sanctions exacerbated a crisis created by Venezuelan government policies. The debt crisis demonstrated government priorities. Venezuela borrowed heavily when oil prices were high. By 2017, it owed over $150 billion to foreign creditors. When oil revenue collapsed, Venezuela faced a choice: pay creditors or feed citizens. It chose creditors for a while. Venezuela made interest payments while hospitals ran out of medicine and people starved. Eventually, in 2017, it defaulted, but the decision to prioritize debt payments over human welfare revealed where government loyalties lay. When the London gold pool closed in March 1968, there was no warning. Investors woke up and the market was locked. No gold available, no conversion. Done. We created the 7-stage collapse survival guide so you never get trapped when the window closes. It shows you exactly when to move your wealth into assets that survive collapse. Before banks freeze, before governments confiscate, before inflation devours your savings. While you can still act, the political system prevented course correction. Maduro faced protests, strikes, and international pressure to change policies. Instead of reform, he doubled down. He created a parallel legislature to bypass the opposition-controlled National Assembly. He arrested opposition leaders, he rigged elections. The 2018 presidential election was widely condemned as fraudulent. By 2019, over 50 countries recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as legitimate president. But Maduro retained military support and stayed in power. The political system that caused the crisis couldn't fix it because fixing it would require admitting failure and ceding power. Bitcoin emerged as an alternative for some Venezuelans. As the Bolivar collapsed, Venezuelans turned to cryptocurrency to preserve wealth and conduct transactions. Venezuela became one of the highest per capita Bitcoin adoption countries. Miners used subsidized electricity, essentially free, to mine Bitcoin and sell it for real value. The government recognized this and tried to control it, creating a national cryptocurrency called the Petro, backed by oil reserves. It failed because the same government that destroyed the Bolivar couldn't create trust in a new currency. Economic theory explains why this happened. Price controls create shortages when prices are set below equilibrium. Nationalizations remove profit incentives and replace market efficiency with political decision-making. Currency controls create black markets and corruption. Deficit spending financed by money printing causes inflation. These aren't controversial among economists. They're basic principles. Venezuela violated all of them simultaneously. The result was predictable, and predicted by economists who were ignored. Comparisons to other countries reveal policy impacts. Colombia, Venezuela's neighbor, had roughly similar GDP per capita to Venezuela in 1950. By 2020, Colombia's GDP per capita was 5 times higher. What was the difference? Economic policies. Colombia maintained relatively free markets, private property rights, and fiscal discipline. It didn't nationalize industries en masse, didn't implement comprehensive price controls, didn't print unlimited money. Colombia has problems, but its citizens aren't eating from garbage cans. Venezuela's policies produce Venezuela's outcomes. The ideological blindness perpetuated the crisis. Chavismo, the political ideology named after Hugo Chávez, blames Venezuela's collapse on everything except its own policies. U.S. imperialism, capitalist sabotage, opposition conspiracies, international sanctions. The rhetoric allows blaming external enemies rather than acknowledging that socialist economic policies destroyed the country. This ideological rigidity prevents learning from failure. Admitting the policies don't work would undermine the entire political project. The oil curse theory partially explains Venezuela's trajectory. Countries with large natural resource wealth often develop poorly, a phenomenon called the resource curse. Easy money from oil exports discourages economic diversification. It enriches elites who have access to resource wealth. It encourages corruption and rent-seeking rather than productive entrepreneurship. It makes governments less accountable because they don't need to tax citizens. They fund themselves from resource sales. Norway avoided the resource curse through institutional discipline and sovereign wealth funds. Venezuela embraced it. The social programs created dependency. Chávez's Misiones, social programs providing food, healthcare, and housing, were popular initially. They distributed oil wealth directly to poor citizens, but they created dependency on government handouts rather than building economic productivity. When oil money disappeared, the programs collapsed. The people who had grown dependent on subsidies had no alternatives. The economy that might have provided jobs and wealth had been destroyed by the same policies that created the social programs. The international leftist support for Venezuela reveals ideological commitment over evidence. Many international observers praised Chavismo in the 2000s as a model for redistributive economics. As Venezuela collapsed, some continued defending the model, blaming sanctions or sabotage. The unwillingness to acknowledge that well-intentioned policies produced catastrophic outcomes prevents learning. If economic disaster is always blamed on external enemies rather than policy failures, the same mistakes get repeated. The cryptocurrency experiment demonstrated Venezuelans' entrepreneurialism despite government obstacles. With the Bolivar worthless, Venezuelans adopted Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other cryptocurrencies for savings and transactions. Remittances from abroad worth $5 billion annually increasingly came as cryptocurrency to avoid government-controlled exchange rates and bank fees. The underground cryptocurrency economy showed that Venezuelans could create alternative economic systems when government-provided systems failed. But this also revealed how government policies had made official systems so dysfunctional that citizens had to operate outside them. The exodus destroyed Venezuela's future productive capacity. The 7 million who left included a disproportionate share of the educated, skilled, and entrepreneurial. Doctors, engineers, teachers, business owners, the people who could rebuild the economy, left because they had options elsewhere. Those who remained were disproportionately the old, the young, and the poor, those without resources to emigrate. Even if policies change tomorrow, Venezuela lacks the human capital to quickly recover. The brain drain is a decades-long wound. Regional destabilization spread from Venezuela's collapse. Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and Brazil absorbed millions of refugees, straining social services and creating political tensions. Venezuelan gangs exported crime to neighboring countries. The refugee crisis became a political issue throughout Latin America. A single country's policy failures created costs for an entire continent. The externalities of Venezuela's collapse extended far beyond its borders. China and Russia supported Maduro for strategic reasons. China lent Venezuela over $50 billion and accepted oil as repayment. Russia sold weapons and provided political support. Both countries saw Venezuela as a foothold in Latin America and a way to challenge U.S. influence. Their support helped Maduro survive when collapse seemed imminent, but neither China nor Russia could fix Venezuela's economy. They extracted what value remained while propping up a government that continued destroying wealth. The recovery path remains unclear. Venezuela's economy contracted 75%. Infrastructure collapsed. Institutions were destroyed. Human capital fled. Even with policy reform, recovery would take decades. But policy reform seems unlikely while Maduro remains in power. The political system that caused collapse shows no signs of changing. The military supports Maduro because it profits from corruption and smuggling. The government bureaucracy supports Maduro because it depends on him for jobs. The opposition is fragmented and suppressed. There's no clear path from disaster to recovery. The international community faces a dilemma. Humanitarian aid is needed, but providing it strengthens Maduro's government by allowing it to avoid addressing its policy failures. Sanctions pressure the government, but also harm ordinary citizens. Intervention risks making things worse. Inaction allows suffering to continue. There are no good options when dealing with a government that has destroyed its own country and shows no willingness to change course. You're witnessing the collapse of a nation that had every advantage: massive oil wealth, educated population, democratic traditions, location near major markets, every resource needed to succeed. And through deliberate policy choices, all of it was destroyed. Price controls eliminated incentives. Nationalizations destroyed efficiency. Currency controls strangled trade. Money printing hyperinflated the currency. The same policies that promised to help the poor impoverished an entire nation. The lessons are universal. Economic laws aren't suggestions. You can't eliminate scarcity through political will. You can't create wealth by redistributing what exists without creating new production. You can't control prices without creating shortages. You can't print money without causing inflation. Venezuela tried to defy these realities. The reality won. It always does. This is Decoded Economics. Subscribe to see the collapse before it happens.